When you guys think of a chemical laboratory, you picture something like this? Or how about something like this? Well, if so, then you have a lot in common with the people that generate stock footage for the internet. In fact, I think this one's called something like Attractive Female Scientist in Glasses, or maybe Handsome Man Looks at Test Tubes. Anyhow, while this may be perfectly well and good in these clean laboratories, how about something like this? Okay, this is your kitchen. This is a laboratory that you guys use every day. Well, okay, somebody uses it every day to feed you, whether it's you or not. What do I mean by that? What is chemistry? Well, chemistry just deals with chemical reactions. And simply put, a chemical reaction is the transformation of one set of chemical substances to another. Pretty simple, right? So what do I mean by that? Why am I in the kitchen to show you? Well, all right, let's say we have some flour. There's some flour. And we take sugar. And an egg. Yep, there's an egg. And maybe some chocolate. Chocolate's wonderful. And we gently mix this up. And we bind all these ingredients together. All right? And once that's mixed up, we take this and we put it in the oven. All right, so that's going to go in the oven. And we're going to use this heat energy to transform these substances. So the flour and the egg and the sugar and even that little bit of chocolate are going to turn into something else. So once that's done, we now take this out of the oven. And what are we left? Well, okay, hold on. And what are we left with, right? Cake, all right? All that stuff transformed into cake. And you're not going to cut into this cake and find eggs and flour and sugar. At least I hope not, right? It is transformed. We've taken those substances and they've become something new. So I'm going to cut myself a piece of this and see if we can explain this a little bit more in a little bit simpler terms. So the whole point of this is that chemistry is delicious. No, that's not the point of this. The whole point of this is that chemistry is part of our everyday lives. That sounds better. And it's not super complicated, right? Yes, it could be in some sort of movie type laboratory, but that's not usually the case. And just so you know, this is stuff that you guys may do every day. In fact, chemical reactions are the ways, or one of the primary ways, that biological organisms use to manipulate their environment, to grow and thrive. Okay, and we're going to see that in primary production. And there's a few different ways that this happens. So in the case of cake, right, we can actually take and show a chemical equation for this. And what this would look like is, say we have our ingredients, and let's simplify it a little bit. Let's say we have A and B. And instead of ingredients, we're going to call those reactants, all right? And we're going to take those and we're going to combine them and we're going to put them in the oven, and we're going to get a chemical reaction. And that little arrow there just means yields, okay? So your reactants come together and yield A and B, all right? So they come together and they're a new thing, and those are called products. So this is a simplified version of a chemical reaction. On one side you have reactants, they yield products. And there are three other main ways that this occurs. And this first one is called a combination or a synthesis reaction. The other thing you can have is a decomposition, which is just basically the opposite of this. So say you have A and B together already, not cake, because this would be impossible, but they're your reactants and they yield the products A plus B. So just the opposite, sometimes this can happen, and I'll show you this here in a minute. A third way, well, third and fourth way is when things swap around. So this first one, let's say you have AB and you have another ingredient or another reactant, C. And they're going to go through a chemical process and they're going to yield AC plus B, right? So the C is actually going to swap with B. And that's a single replacement, right? One of those things, atoms, molecule, whatever it was, replaced with another. And then the final one is just slightly more complicated than that, and it's a double replacement. So say you had AB plus CD as your reactants, and they yield AD plus CB. Hopefully you guys can see it there. I hope I'm saying this right. Anyhow, they're your products. So those are the four main ways, and that's a double replacement reaction. All of these also either require energy or actually yield energy, and those are two other main ways that these chemical reactions occur, because we've already been talking about this energy, and you guys can already see this probably has a lot to do with that. So in the case of our cake, that required energy, right? We took our reactants, our ingredients, mixed them together and put them in the oven, took that heat energy to give us deliciousness. And that is something called an endothermic reaction. It requires energy. The other one is one that produces energy, okay? And that's called an exothermic reaction. So things get together, they yield their products and produce energy. And another way to think of that is think about fire, right? That is clearly producing energy. So we're going to use this, and we're definitely going to go forward and talk about primary productivity, but we're going to need to take, things simple like this and actually put these equations to them. And I'm not even going to attempt to figure out all the chemicals that are in the ingredients that go into cake and write those out. But we can take something a little simpler that maybe you guys have used before. So if you have ever used, say, these instant hot and cold packs, well, this is using some really simple chemistry and stuff you probably already understand at this point to produce either hot or cold instantly. So we'll first start with hot. So you get one of these packs, right? And they always come, for the hot ones, they come in plastic, right? There's no air in here, and there's a reason for that. So once you open them, see if I can open this up here, and there's some stuff in there, and it tells you, you got to shake it around. Well, what you're really doing is you're getting it exposed to the air. And what is in here is iron. All right, these are some combination of iron and other things, but the main thing is iron. And what you're doing is, this is a combination reaction, and it also happens to be, remember, exothermic, right? It's producing heat. So the iron combines with the oxygen and air. So you can see it here, 4 iron atoms and 3 oxygen molecules combine, and they give you an iron oxide. Well, some of you may know this, you may not. That's just rust. So what these instant hot packs are doing is rusting. You actually do have to have a little bit of moisture in there, but that's all that's going on. So this is a combination exothermic reaction, very, very simply with just 2 ingredients, all right, iron and oxygen. And that is your nice warm pack. And these are hot hands or whatever else you guys might use to warm up. And then your other one, these cold packs. So this is slightly different. You're going to take this out, and the directions say in here to break the inner bag with liquid in it. Well, what that liquid is mostly just water. All right, maybe some other stuff in there. They don't really tell you on the box, but this is another fairly simple reaction, and this is actually one of these decomposition reactions. So the solid parts that you have in there are some sort of ammonium nitrate, and you can see the chemical formula here. And what this does is it breaks up into ammonium and nitrate. It just separates, just like that. So this is a decomposition. And the reason it is endothermic is because it's actually pulling energy out of the liquid that you just broke in here. And like I said, it's water. And if you guys remember from our energy discussion, our heat discussion, is even water that's fairly cool still contains heat. It still contains energy. So what this ammonium nitrate does is it takes away some of that heat to be able to break up and give you, again, ammonium and nitrate, but in the process, it's cooling down that liquid. All right, it's making it colder and colder, so you instantly get a cold pack. So those are 2 very simple ways to think of these chemical reactions. Again, we use it not even for something this complicated, just baking or other things in our daily lives, staying warm, and we're going to use this again to talk about primary production. So I'm going to finish my cake and get myself cleaned up and get back into the appropriate place to have some information behind me, and we'll continue this discussion. I'll see you guys back here in a little bit. I know at the very first lecture in this semester, I told you that was pretty much all we were going to talk about marine biology. Well, I wasn't lying, so let me see if I can clarify a little bit. Let's talk about the difference between marine biology and biological oceanography. Okay, so what do you think of when you think of marine biology?
There's a beached whale. She's dying.
Is anyone here a marine biologist?
All right, well, that's fine. But what it really means is a biologist that studies biology in the ocean. Okay, that might seem kind of self-explanatory. Let me clarify that a little bit. All right, so you can study mammals on land, you can study mammals in the ocean. You can study plants on land, and you can study plants in the ocean. All right, so a marine biologist is a biologist that specializes in ocean organisms. Now, biological oceanography, on the other hand, is more like an oceanographer that specializes in biology. Okay, probably even more confusing, but let's see if we can do this. So, a biological oceanographer will use biological processes to incorporate into all these other things we've been talking about, right? All these other physical, chemical, and geological processes, the world ocean. So if that's still kind of confusing, let's get through this whole lecture, because really this is all about biological oceanography. So hopefully by the end we'll kind of have a better idea of what those two mean. And yes, this is called primary production. So what does that have to do with biology? What are we producing anyhow? What are these primary producers doing? Well, let's go back to something we already talked about, and we discussed the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph, okay? So an autotroph makes its own food, and a heterotroph has to eat to survive, right? It has to eat food like us. So plants and us, or in the ocean, we already said, you know, this is like the phytoplankton, here's some diatoms, and the zooplankton. All right, so that's the autotroph and heterotroph. So these primary producers, these phytoplankton, are the first step in that production of food, all right? So the first thing you need to know is that primary producers, oh, there we go, the basis of different communities. I guess I could have put that up a little bit. Anyhow, primary producers, right? You know, we've already talked a bit about open ocean, and that's a bunch of coccolithophores there probably. And then we just went into these kelp forests and these seagrass beds. And we'll talk a little bit today and more later about these deep sea communities that also do primary production. And the reason we care about this, like I said, it's the basis for these communities. So as we discuss these interactions and whatnot, we're actually going to do this in a way that talks mostly about energy exchange. And we're going to use something called a trophic pyramid, all right? And so when I say basis, I literally mean the bottom of this pyramid are your primary producers. And this is all about energy exchange, because yes, the phytoplankton make their food, the zooplankton eat them, and then small fish, yada yada, tuna, and then tuna sandwich. Well, hopefully, a tuna sandwich doesn't actually contain phytoplankton, all right? But it contains the energy that they originally harnessed from the sun. So this is all about that energy transfer. So maybe we're getting closer now to this biological oceanography. We're using these organisms to explain this energy transfer. Well, I've said energy a lot. I kind of keep throwing that term around. But what really is energy? All right. In its simplest form, simplest definition, I should say, it's a measurable property that must be transferred to an object to heat the object or to perform work. Well, we've already talked a lot about heat. You know, we talked about the difference between heat and temperature. We could see that it's a change, you know, from lower kinetic energy to higher kinetic energy. But what about this work? What is work? Because that's really what we want to get into here. This is really what biology is doing. And work, simply put, is just a force over a distance, all right? Force times distance. And you guys already know what force is, right? This is a mass times an acceleration. Well, work is just taking that weight, right, that force, and moving it a distance. So let's say, for example, your car stalls, and you have to get out and push. Well, now you have that car, and you're having to move it over a certain distance, however far you can get it, and you've just performed work. So the difference here, because we know what force is the difference between your car breaking down and getting a flat tire on your bicycle. Well, if you get out and have to push your bicycle, it's not nearly as difficult, because we know this force is a mass times an acceleration. So the mass state is much, much greater on a car than it is a bicycle. So you're going to have to perform more work. All right. So we know work. That's fine. Spoiler alert, I'm not going to make you do any calculations here. So as you're furiously scribbling that down, calm down a little bit. What I really want to get to is back to what energy is, because that's kind of the main point of all of this. And if you're thinking, I still don't really understand what energy is, you're not doing a very good job explaining it, you're probably right, because energy is one of these things that's a bit nebulous, right? It's hard to put your finger on, right? We use it as an accounting tool, all right? As we move, and we can see it sometimes, and it is measurable in different forms. So again, I'm skirting around. So let me give you an example. Let me give you somewhat of an analogy. All right, something we know has energy. Let's take fire. all right? We know fire has energy, right? We know we can feel the heat coming off of it. We know there's energy there. Well, if I take a bowl of, let's say, yogurt and oatmeal and blueberries, and I put it over that fire, and I let it sit there, what's going to happen? Well, if you thought disgusting, you're probably right. Now, there may be some people that like to boil their blueberries and yogurt and oatmeal, but I'm not one of them. Right? It's not going to happen. So we've transferred energy, but we don't really want to. It wasn't very useful. So let's get rid of that bowl. Now let's take this same fire, and let's put a pot of water over it. And that pot of water is going to boil, and it's going to produce steam. And that steam, let's say we put that into a turbine, okay? And then that turbine is going to power a generator. And that generator is going to create electricity. And then we can take that electricity all the way over, and we can put it into something with a motor attached to blades. And we can spin those blades with our yogurt and oatmeal and blueberries, and then we get something delicious. All right? So that aside, food aside, you can think of energy as sort of this accounting tool. This is our electricity analogy. There was energy the whole way around. We just kind of changed it. So it wasn't necessarily just heat that we're putting into this, but we were able to convert it as we go around. Again, it's sort of an accounting tool. But we were also able to take that energy from fire and perform work. So those blades spinning in that blender were doing work. Okay, well, back to our biology, back to our primary producers, all right? Well, they don't really have the ability to run generators and boil steam and whatnot, so they have to do something else. So how are they going to create this energy and transfer it around, transfer it up that trophic pyramid? Well, let's go back to what we first started this lecture on, and that was chemical reactions, okay? And that's what biology uses. Biology uses chemistry for this energy transfer. So we have a chemical reaction like we already talked about. You know, on the left here we have our reactants, so the C6H12O6. We have 6 oxygen molecules, and then those arrows again means yield, right? And that gives us our products. So we get 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water molecules, and energy, all right? That's the important part. And as it turns out, this chemical reaction is something that most organisms use. You and I use it, and it's something called cellular respiration. This is respiration. And we use this to produce energy, to do work. All right? So that energy goes into the fact that I'm moving now, the fact that you have to push a car or a bicycle. Right? That's our energy. It goes into our muscles. It goes into our cells. That's what we need. So for us heterotrophs, right, all we have to do is find some of this C6H12O6. Well, what the heck is that? Well, specifically, this molecule is something called glucose. You guys may have heard of this. And the simplest way to describe glucose is that it's sugar. All right? There's several different forms of sugar, but this is the type of sugar our body uses for cellular respiration. So for us, we just have to go find sugar. And where do we find that? Well, we can pretty easily find it in things like apples, right? I mean, that's a fructose. It's a bit different, but we convert it. But our body's pretty good at taking other things and making sugars out of them, but still these base products, so fats and proteins and whatnot. But it has to come from somewhere, right? That apple, right? The apple tree didn't eat something else. That's our primary producer. So our primary producers make this sugar, all right? And they do this in a few different ways, but one you're probably most familiar with, okay, is using the sun's energy, growing and producing. Actually, I guess that's a tomato. I should have thought of that analogy before I got here. But anyhow, it can make tomatoes, right? Takes in carbon dioxide, also produces some oxygen. And this also is a chemical reaction, and it's called photosynthesis. And you guys have probably heard about this, right? The process used by most producers to convert the sun's energy to food energy. So again, this is taking the sun, which we can feel energy, right? We can stand there, we can feel the heat, but we can't exactly go outside and open our mouths and feel full and think it's delicious. But producers are able to use a chemical reaction, again, to do that conversion into something useful. Tomatoes, sugar. And that chemical reaction looks something like this. All right, same thing. We have our we have our reactants in our products. On this side, we have carbon dioxide, 6 of those, some water. Right, that solar energy comes here in the middle, and we get glucose and oxygen. So here's that glucose. And inside a plant will do all of this. Okay, so they're able to take this light energy, right, and they bring it into things called chloroplasts. You guys remember these from biology class long, long ago. And these chloroplasts do photosynthesis, okay? They take in the light energy, carbon dioxide, and water, magic, all right? And then they produce glucose and oxygen. And then that glucose and oxygen goes into our mitochondria, which is also inside a plant cell, all right? And the mitochondria, again, take that oxygen and glucose, and they spit out water, carbon dioxide, and that chemical energy that we use to do work. And this keeps cycling, right? This goes around and around inside every plant cell. It is a constant process of light energy coming in and chemical energy coming out. So if I go back to our electricity analogy, you can sort of think of glucose like a battery, right? The chloroplast and the mitochondria aren't connected with wires. So a chloroplast takes its discharge battery and fills it up and then passes it on to the mitochondria, which plugs it in and is able to get energy out of it. And once that's drained, it puts it back again, all right? So this, again, kind of staying in that process. Now, heterotrophs like us, well, we don't have chloroplasts, right? We're stuck down here. All we have are mitochondria. All we can do is cellular respiration, and we have to eat other things to get that glucose to go into that. So that's that difference between a autotroph and a heterotroph. Autotrophs have both of these, heterotrophs don't. So this is mostly photosynthesis, and again, most primary producers use this, but even especially in the ocean, we actually have other forms of primary reduction. One of the main ones is something called chemosynthesis. So photo light, chemochemical. All right, so still a chemical reaction. We take in some carbon dioxide and water, just like in photosynthesis, and we get sugar. Except in this case, instead of light, we use, this is just an example, something like hydrogen sulfide and we get out other sulfur compounds. The important part is we use the bonds. There's energy stored in the bonds of these inorganic compounds. And certain organisms, like bacteria that live in the deep ocean, are able to break the bonds in these inorganic molecules and extract that energy. And they can use that instead of the sun's energy to make glucose, to then go back and do cellular energy and all that same stuff that we already talked about. So in general, primary production, right? Photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis needs light. Chemosynthesis occurs in the total darkness of the ocean floor. But mainly also I want you to know that chemosynthesis is really kind of a minor part. It's really cool, and actually the reason I study microbiology, or at least one of the reasons, is because they do some amazing metabolic processes that aren't just photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But anyhow, so much less than photosynthesis, 2 to 5% of the water column. So we're going to stick primarily to photosynthesis when we talk about primary production. So back to our trophic pyramid, we now have the mechanism that these primary producers use, all right? Mostly photosynthesis, some chemosynthesis. They're the basis of these communities because they take otherwise unavailable energy and turn it into something that everything else can use, all right? So not just phytoplankton, but again, things we've already talked about, the kelp, the seagrasses, and oh, by the way, yes, also corals. Corals have inside of them phytoplankton. They have a symbiotic relationship. The phytoplankton are nice and happy because they live in a safe place, but they also do photosynthesis and provide the corals with glucose. So anyhow, this is where our primary producers come from. And this is also, again, now, hopefully you can see a little bit more about this biological oceanography. Is we really want to see how these are incorporated into this whole thing. And you know, a marine biologist may specialize in tuna, but they're going to use information from biological oceanography to put all the pieces together. So biological oceanographers can do something cool with primary production, is they can observe this stuff from space. So this is a satellite photo of the Earth. Hopefully that should be obvious. And the greener the area is, the more primary productivity is going on. And the reason we can see this is because those chloroplasts that use chlorophyll to do photosynthesis, well, that chlorophyll does something called fluoresce. And that just means that when a certain wave of light hits it, it'll emit another wave of light, all right? So what this is showing is these light waves emitted from here in the ocean, right? Mostly phytoplankton. You know, you can see the Amazon here is also green. But we can see how much productivity is going on over the entire planet just by observing that fluorescence from that chlorophyll. Okay, so we got primary production. We know what primary producers are. They're down here in our trophic pyramid. We've already talked about zooplankton, right? They're that next level. They're the primary consumers. So they're eating those phytoplankton, and they're using their own cellular respiration and other processes to convert that energy from phytoplankton into either swimming around to go catch more food, building biomass and getting bigger, and then it keeps going up into this trophic pyramid. Well, after you get here, the rest of this is sort of an example, right? I would say down here is relatively cut and dry. But again, if you guys remember, right, the biggest thing that has ever lived on the planet, the blue whale, eats zooplankton. So he just right in there, like we don't even care. So the important part here is that really our communities are these complicated food webs. So yes, we want to talk about energy exchange, and that trophic pyramid is great for that. But it's all about the interaction. So you have a kelp forest food pyramid, or I'm sorry, food web. You have a coral reef, and if you remember from the open ocean, right, all those organisms interacting. So that's primary production. That's biological oceanography. And to make it, not more complicated, but we're going to add a lot more stuff. So this is your first class participation exercise for this module. And what I want you to do is look at these food webs, right? Again, this is a pretty complicated interaction. What do you think could disturb this? What could affect these webs? What could affect these interactions in organisms? And it's most stuff we've already talked about. Maybe some stuff you haven't thought of yet. So I'm going to leave that for you guys to do. And the other thing too is pay real close attention to the point value on this exercise, because while it might just be one question, I'm looking for a few things. So the point value should be a really good indicator on how many things you should write down. If you don't write enough down, then yes, you won't get all of those points. So anyhow, I hope you now understand that difference between marine biology and biological oceanography, what primary producers are. So make sure you email me with questions if you have them. Get working on that homework, come to my office hours, and other than that, I'll see you next time to really start talking about what are the things that affect these interactions. See you guys later.